Okay. So again, you have 7 units with which to play with. Tuesday, today, we're talking about units 1, 2, and 3. Tomorrow, we're going to talk 4 through 6. And then Thursday is going to be predominantly the early 1900s, the early 20th century. And then, of course, on Thursday, I'll go over test taking tips. Now, again, I want to stress, especially if you know this is the only night that you can log in, or you've been doing some review and, man, I need you to go over this. Just because I'm going over units 1, 2, and 3 does not mean you can't ask a question about unit 6. It does not mean you can't answer, ask a question about the Civil War. So please feel free to jump in if you've been doing some review and you're like, man, I need to go over this, or I don't remember this, or hey, can you explain, even if it was any of the DBQs as you were going back over them, if there were things that came up in your review sessions where you're just like, man, I need some help, please feel free. The other thing that I'm going to stress and really pass on to fellow students that are taking the exam on Friday, all this week, when you have some spare time, you should be reaching out to friends and talking. Okay, just talking your history stuff, asking questions of each other. If you've got the review questions, if you've got the little reviewed flashcards that I handed out earlier, those are great to just kind of like spark little, obvious review, but also, hey, we need to ask this during the review sessions to make sure we know. Okay, so please make sure that you're utilizing this as much as possible so that you're ready on Friday. Friday's exam, to make sure everybody's on the same page, you should receive an email from the college board that basically asks if your computer is up and running, if everything's ready to go. You should receive a test to your system. And if you have not, it is on their website, and it's also in an email I gave you now about 3 weeks ago. If you have yet to check your computer system to make sure that you can log into the AP portal to take your exam, you need to do that over the next couple of days to make sure everything is a go. Because the last thing you want is on Friday to have an issue with that. Another thing that came up today, Mr. Flickinger's students and Mr. Ficker's students took their AP exams already. Ficker's kids reported back that they were given the option to handwrite their essays, take a picture of it, and send it in. I would really, really discourage that, because they ran into a problem where when they took their photos, it had to be a specific format. And they wouldn't accept anything but JPEG and something else. And these kids were trying to turn in like PDFs, and they were trying to turn in whatever. Just type it. I know it might be easier because some of you like to kind of write it. It might be more therapeutic that way. Unfortunately, they've been running into so many problems with that. It's so much better for you and for your state of being, state of mind, to just type it directly into the system so you know it's there. Okay, that's number one. Number two, there were a couple of kids that had trouble logging in because they didn't check their system. So Flickinger and Ficker have been trying desperately to help those kids out, but there was nothing they could do because they're not in the room with somebody, and because they were logged into the portal, there was nothing, it's not like they could share the screen or anything like that. So just make sure you're ready to go so that you have the peace of mind knowing that at 2 p.m. on Friday, you log in and you're just typing. You're reading through your documents and you're just typing. Okay. You don't want the added stress of, oh my God, it won't log me in. Okay. Should that happen, you do have a secondary date with which to take the exam. A makeup date, but that is not what you want to do, because it's been made very clear to us that June date, aside from being a month later, is also going to be a harder question. So do not skip out on Friday. Take the exam this Friday. And Baker was just kind of mentioning, hey, some of the teachers are starting to ease off a little bit. It's been kind of nice this week. There's been a little less work. Folks, how academically prepared are you going to be if you wait until June? Let's be honest. You're going to be transitioning into summer brain, which for many of you, it's pretty standard, but some of you know it's just going to get worse. It's not going to get any better. You're going to, release any knowledge that you do have is going to drain out, and you're going to be, typing just to type instead of actually being able to come up with a fairly decent answer to whatever the question may be. So please make sure all of your I's are dotted, your T's are crossed before Friday's test date to make sure A, you have a computer, B, your family understands you need it quiet for 45 minutes to an hour to make sure everything's okay, so that you can indeed get everything done. So we're going to go over some test taking tips as we go through this, but I want to at least get to the nuts and bolts of the units. And again, please interrupt if you have questions, and please feel free to ask follow-up questions of whatever I present to you here. Again, this is not designed for me to be lecturing at you for however long this takes. And again, if you're like me, you're kind of glossing over something, can you expand? You can chat it, or you can just interrupt. That's why I want your microphones on, so that you can feel free to just say, slow down, expand, explain it better. You're just talking right now and I don't get it, whatever. You're not going to offend me, and there's nothing I can do anyway. We're online. So, Unit 1, Native Societies, pre-1492. If they ask a question about this, you will hear a collective groan from every AP teacher. We have been in AP sessions with the College Board where people have asked, how much do we have to get them ready with Native Societies? And we've pretty much gotten the standard answer that there's no way they could possibly derive a DBQ out of it. So what do you really need to know about Native Societies? Something that might be linked to other units, meaning westward expansion, Native American tribes who used to be on the coast are now on the Great Plains. So what I mean by that is they could ask a Native American question over time. The reason that we bring this up, and Dowling from Coleraine and I are on the same page with this might be the DBQ that they raise. Why? Native American societies have been in the news a lot recently. In case you haven't noticed, there have been Native American issues about a pipeline that was going through the Dakotas. And it was going through Native territory, through a reservation. And at Standing Rock, they were having a showdown with the federal government over whether or not the federal government can step in and take land away from them or take the land rights away from them. So that's been in the news. And then even more recently, the Sioux tribe, and then it's the Sioux, and there's one other tribe, and I'm blanking, that have been going mano a mano with the governor of South Dakota because they are shutting down federal highways that lead to Native American reservations, meaning you can't get off the highway to go into the reservations because they are concerned that COVID-19 will come in with outside influence and visitors. So they're shutting down federal highways. That has caused the governor to say you can't do that, and these Native leaders saying yes, we can. So they're going back and forth on that. There's a showdown. Because of that being in the news, we both have talked about how that could possibly come up as a question. So Unit 1 might be applicable if we're talking about first contact, okay? And what the Native societies were before. Now remember, the one thing you always have to remember about Native societies of North America, they were very diversified. That's the one thing they always want to bring up. Remember, I know this is many, many moons ago, but when we first started the year, I had you do that stupid thing where you drew, a typical Native American, okay? And a lot of you came up with the same basic stuff. Oh, they have tomahawks, and they wear moccasins, and they put feathers in their hair, and they wear makeup, and they live in teepees. And remember, we talked about how not every society is the same, okay? That's the part you need to remember, that they are a very diverse group of people. The Mohawk are not like the Mohicans, who are not like the Pueblos, who are not like the Shawnee, who are not like the Seminoles. And why? Just like the American people right now, they live in different regions. You would not say that somebody who lives in Miami Beach is the same as somebody who lives in Bangor, Maine, and somebody else who lives in Portland, Oregon. We are different in what we wear. We're different in what we eat. We're different in our lifestyles. And if this pandemic has proven anything, some states are way more open about, like, we need to go back to work. We don't care. And there are others who are locked down. So a lot of times when we're talking about cultural differences, these native societies were just like us when it came to diversity of opinion, diversity of dress, diversity of cuisine, everything. Okay. So always keep that in mind, that the reason the natives really struggled when Columbus first comes here and the Europeans start to follow, they're not on the same page because they also don't get along with the other tribes around them. And what Columbus and the conquistadors and the English that follow have in common is that they play these societies off against each other. So that just funnels into Unit 2, First Contact, 1492. Why does it matter? Columbus gets lost. He lands in what is today the Dominican Republic on Hispaniola. He gets off the boat and says, Indians. And, Lord knows if his actual crew believes him, but he basically makes it seem like they've landed in India. He knows he didn't land in India. Okay. He's read enough tales from other explorers to know that this is definitely not India. How do we know that? He takes slaves back with him. He would not have done that if he was in India. Okay. He also realizes they don't have the same products that remember, why are they trying to go to India? They're trying to get spices. They're trying to get that. Okay. When they don't find that there, but they do find other things like sugar, and they find things like cocoa, and they find a little bit of gold, that spurs the Spanish to come over. Now, the one thing you have to remember about the Spanish is that they have the encomienda system. They're the ones that established the modern day plantation system for the Americans. That's the idea that we are going to have a group of...
Sorry, I'm trying to mute it. Got it.
Killing me, Smalls. All right. So the encomienda system, that's one of the main impacts upon the American colonies of the British, is that they teach us how to have plantations, how to use slaves, and quite honestly, how to set up a colony. The British are going to tweak that, of course, because the Spanish are only setting up colonies for what eventually becomes known as imperialism, parent country taking over a people to kind of drain their resources. So the Spanish that's what they're trying to do. The English still are draining their colonies, there's no question, but it's kind of a slow drain, a slow burn, if you will. Mercantilism is going to be their byproduct. They're going to switch it. They're going to take this Spanish model and they're going to kind of up the ante, and they're going to kind of come up with their own version of it. Okay. So colonial America, what stands separately from the Spanish, what stands separately from the French, because remember, the French take over what is today Canada, and they really are only there for the fur. They're there for the lumber. They're not really interested in setting up massive colonies. And remember, Quebec, Montreal, Toronto, still very small. Even during the French and Indian War, these are not massive metropolitan areas. These are trading posts. So the French are not interested in settling. The British are. The Spanish, not interested in settling. They never really bring over a large amount of females. This is not a family settlement down in the South American colonies. They're only interested in kind of pillaging it for sugar and gold, the 3Gs, if you remember that. The British are different on this. They are trying to set up colonies. Now, what are they trying to set up colonies for? If you remember, they set up 13 separate and distinct colonies. This is something that Dowling and I think you might actually be asked about. Is the question could be, since we talked about regional differences being in the news, if you remember during colonial America, we talked about regional differences. Can anybody remember the 4 regional differences, or 4 regions, I should say?
I can think of 3 of them.
Give me at least one.
There was the New England area. It was kind of north, but not quite.
New England is the most northern.
Oh yeah,
of the 13. Okay, of the 4 regions, I should say. And remember, New England, they all have things in common. It's Massachusetts, it's Connecticut, it's Rhode Island, and it's New Hampshire. So New England constitutes 4 colonies. And remember, Maine is still part of Massachusetts at that point. Okay. Vermont is still part of New York at that point. So again, we're talking about Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. All of those are small farms, lumber, shipbuilding, and let's be honest, all of them are set up on some religious reason. And three of them definitely. New Hampshire's the odd bird out here, but Massachusetts is set up by the Puritans to be a safe haven for the separatists, the people that stepped away from the Anglican Church or wanted to clean it up, or just basically annoyed people back in England and the Netherlands so much they just kicked them out. And keep in mind, they came over here and immediately set out to, create the city upon the hill. If you remember John Winthrop, is creating the city upon the hill. We're going to create the perfect society. And within the first, 30 or 40 years, they actually do set up a fairly decent colony in Massachusetts. But the religious fervor gets out of control by the late 1600s because they start to burn witches. Okay. Witches, whatever, in Salem. So there are bad byproducts to this as well. But they have this in common where they've got the religious fervor that then kind of culminates into, well, do these people have a say in the colony? Do they have some sort of representation? Because remember, they're still under the control of the king, but this is the person they were trying to get away from. So in seeking religious freedom and trying to set up a religious colony through the Mayflower Compact, over time, they're going to parlay that into, well, we get to determine our own way of being. So Massachusetts, from its very beginning, is going to be very different than the other 12 colonies in their mentality. And keep in mind, when we're talking about revolutionary America way down the line, Massachusetts is going to produce Sam Adams, John Hancock, these people that from the very beginning, word go, are talking about revolution when everybody else is talking, man, this is unfortunate. So these are going to be the firebrands. Okay. It's not a surprise that a religiously fervent colony is going to inspire our most ardent voices for independence. Connecticut, not as much, but if you remember, they set up as kind of like, whoa, we're not as serious as those suckers over in Massachusetts. Let's kind of do our own thing over here. And Rhode Island ends up being the place where anybody that gets kicked out of Massachusetts, like Roger Williams, like Anne Hutchinson, that's where they go when they aren't good enough for Massachusetts Bay. Okay. And then New Hampshire, again, just kind of the odd bird out. But all four of them, small family farms, shipbuilding, lumber, it's that they're pretty standard across the board with that. That's New England. Anybody remember any of the other three? Come on, folks, we can do it.
Wasn't there one area that was kind of nicknamed the breadbasket?
No, not the breadbasket.
There was one. I feel like
the middle colonies.
The middle colonies, the mid-Atlantic colonies. Okay, either way, middle colonies, mid-Atlantic. You're talking in that region: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Okay, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. What sets them apart is they're very metropolitan comparative to the other colonies. Why? New York has New York City. Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. New Jersey's just kind of sandwiched in between. But all of them are based around shipping, mercantile interests, meaning they're trading back and forth. They're kind of the middlemen for everybody else. So if you know the term middleman, middle colonies should come to mind because they're kind of facilitating the economy by trading. They're the ones that have the ships. They're the ones that have the dockyards. They're the ones that are kind of facilitating the American economy. Okay. And keep in mind, they still consider themselves the British economy. So it's not a surprise that they're set up in that region to be a little less apt to go to the revolutionary cause. If you remember, the people that are slowest to the cause are New York, New Jersey, and for the most part, except for Ben Franklin, Pennsylvania. They're a little slow to the cause because they don't want to tip the scales of their economy. Okay. And of course, there were other colonies that were a little slow too, but there's a reason why those colonies kind of stick out a little bit. The other thing is their religions. Keep in mind, New York was not founded as a religious colony. It was founded by the Dutch. Remember, it was New Netherlands, and New York City was actually New Amsterdam. They were founded to be a trading post only. There was no religion involved. So when the revolution comes along, there's no religious fervor in this. There's no, New York has religion. Don't get me wrong, they have religion, but that's not the primary pursuit of their colony. Pennsylvania, on the other hand, were Quakers. Quakers, William Penn sets up the colony. It was a safe haven for Quakers, but it was also a safe haven for anybody else too. Pennsylvania is the most open of all the colonies when it comes to religious freedom. Nobody cares what you are. Keep in mind, the Quakers were also open to Native Americans living within their system. This is why Philadelphia becomes the city of brotherly love, and that's why Philadelphia grows to be the biggest city in America, because people feel safe there. There's nobody that's going to walk down the street and condemn you for not being Anglican or not being Presbyterian or not being Jewish or Catholic or whatever. They don't care. The one thing the Quakers do care about, war. They don't fight. They are pacifists. They don't understand why there needs to be a conflict. So they're going to be a little less apt to go to war because of that background and that background alone. It's going to take a lot to push them over the line to independence later on. Okay. Now, the two other colonies, the two other colonial regions, they are below them on the map. Anybody remember what those colonial associations were known as?
The Southern?
Southern colony. That's one of them. The Southern colonies in this instance, we're talking about Georgia and the Carolinas. Okay, Georgia and the Carolinas. What's their commonality?
Tobacco.
They're not necessarily tobacco.
Rice?
Okay. Rice production, indigo production. They are the very first plantations. Now, Jones, you're not necessarily wrong with tobacco when it comes to North Carolina. North Carolina is the Tar Heel state because of a massive amount of tobacco farming and the fact that people who work out in tobacco fields, especially if they're barefooted, tend to get the sticky black feet. Okay. So if you've ever wondered why in the hell the North Carolina Tar Heels, the collegiate team is called that, it's an old tobacco, terminology, if you will. Okay. But the Carolinas and Georgia have that in common. And if those are cash crops, what do they also have in common?
Slavery.
Yes. They are the ones that have the massive amount of the slaves. Now, that is not to be confused with the other southern colonies, too. Now, they are different. They are called the Chesapeake, okay, because they're around the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake region is Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland, okay? They also have slavery. And Mr. Jones, I kind of jumped too quickly. Yes, the Carolinas have tobacco, but the massive amount of tobacco at that time are in the Chesapeake. It's mostly Maryland and Virginia that are farming that, at least. And keep in mind that comes from Jamestown early on in the 1600s. Okay. Those also, again, have slavery. Okay. But it's a different form of slavery. Whereas in the Deep South, slavery is becoming more and more of an industry. And after the Revolution, after Eli Whitney changes the Southern economy to cotton, slavery is going to change. Okay. In Virginia, it's not as much of they have the slavery, but it's not as much of a massive problem. You notice there was not a huge abolitionist movement during the 1700s in colonial America. Just it wasn't a huge deal. It was just considered part of the society. Okay. And the reason was it had not turned into a massive cash commodity, if you will. Okay. Now, we can certainly sit here in this day and age and realize, well, who cares what slavery is like? It's still wrong. They did not view it the same way in the 1700s, okay, or the 1600s for that matter either. Okay, and keep in mind, this is the time of also our founding fathers. Our founding fathers were born into this society before America had separated from Great Britain. So we're talking about Jefferson, we're talking about Washington. These are the Virginia gentlemen who own massive amounts of slaves, but never feel comfortable with it. Okay, doesn't mean it's okay. You know, Washington frees all of his slaves in his will, but the vast majority of his actual slaves were his wife's. Okay, so they did not get their freedom. So it's kind of a cop out that yes, some did get their freedom from George Washington when he died in 199. When he dies, his slaves are released, but he doesn't really have that many comparative to his wife. Jefferson never does. You know, he kind of hems and haws about it for years about how wrong this is. He's the one that compares slavery to a wolf. We're holding the wolf by the ears. We don't like it, but we dare not let go. Okay, he's constantly in writing talking about how slavery is wrong. Even in the Declaration of Independence, his first draft, his rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, he tries to blame it all on the king. Okay, he's trying desperately to get rid of it, but he's basically trying to make somebody else make him get rid of his slaves. He won't do it himself. And we can go back and forth on Jefferson, but keep in mind, I'm only bringing that up as an illustration that the Chesapeake region and slavery, and they probably had more from the very beginning. They definitely did have more than the Carolinas, but over time that flip-flops where the Carolinas have a vast majority. South Carolina at one point has 5 slaves for every 1 person. Their ratio is out of control, which means South Carolina is going to be absolutely afraid of any sort of slave uprising. Virginia isn't quite on that level. It depends on where you are in Virginia, but as a colony, they're really not as inundated with the slaves as much as the Carolinas are eventually towards the end of the 1700s. Be that as it may, those are the 4 colonial regions. They have very, very different reasons for existing. Again, they are New England. They are the middle colonies or mid-Atlantic colonies, the Chesapeake region, and the Deep South. Okay, those are the 4 regions, all very distinct. The one thing that you can also kind of mark, when they're founded, all 13 of them have slaves in them. Okay, I want to make that clear. All 13 allowed for slavery from the very beginning. Okay, it was as we started moving towards independence, got it, and then into the early 1800s, that states started to say, we're no longer allowing this. So when did slavery first start to disappear? When the colonies became states. It was no longer Great Britain's fault. It was now our fault that it was happening. And that's what caused the abolitionist movement to take root in the early 1800s, because now we couldn't pawn it off on Britain anymore. We couldn't say, well, I mean, the policy is theirs. It wasn't. Now it's ours. And you started to see the general shift. And you started to see Massachusetts say no more. If we're going to say all men are created equal in our founding documents, we got to get rid of it. Okay, you're going to see New York gradually emancipate their slaves. You're going to see in the late 1700s, the Northwest Ordinance, when it comes in 1787, the 5 states that eventually come out of that, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, all 5 of them are told you will not have slavery. Okay, so even the territory, before they're even allowed in as states, are told they can't have slaves. Okay, so keep that in mind, because that might be a question that comes up too, is when did abolition really start to take hold? Okay, colonial times, it didn't. Early 1800s, it did, but it was regional. Okay, believe it or not, the biggest push for abolitionism during the American Revolution was actually in the South. Okay, the South was the one that was worried, and it wasn't out of some unbelievably, nice, benevolent reason. It was because they were worried the British were going to invade and make the slaves turn against the masters. So there were a number of masters that were saying we should free them, and we should start talking about how important it is for equality, because we don't want them to rise up against us, because the British did try to do that. Okay, and they were somewhat successful, especially in South Carolina, at turning some of the slaves against their former masters. Okay, so again, I want to make sure you understand that as we move forward about colonial America. Now, the final unit is Revolution and Republic. Okay, This is what I want to spend the vast majority of our time on tonight. Revolution and Republic, 1754 to 1800. There is a general progression all the way through this, and you need to understand the timeline. This is a timeline you should probably just have, okay, or at least remember, so that if this is the question you get, you're not looking it up. Remember I said during the DBQ stuff, you can have your textbook next to you, you can have your notes next to you, you can have whatever resources you want. It's an open book test, but you won't have time to look up specifics, okay? You just won't. Here's the basic understanding that you need to get. 1754 to 1763. What do those years mean? 1754 to 1763. What happened?
That was that French and Indian War?
Yes,
Oh,
that was the French and Indian War. Now, as a reminder, the French and the British have been fighting each other for quite some time. They had King William's War, they had Queen Anne's War, they had the War of Jenkins' Ear, they had King George's War, they had all these wars. And most of them were, border disputes, glorified border disputes. Where does Michigan begin and, Canada end? The French and Indian War is the first one that becomes a global undertaking. Because remember, French and Indian War starts in 1754, but the 7 Years' War starts in 1756. Okay, so 2 years after we started here, it starts over in Europe. Okay, and then expands across the globe. Okay, and it's mostly because Britain, France, and eventually Spain, who gets involved, all have massive navies. So that's why it becomes a world war. They're fighting in their colonies, colonial holdings in the West Indies. They're fighting in the Asiatic regions, the colonies they had taken over there. They're fighting everywhere. Okay, and really, it's the First World War. Okay, they don't call it that, but in reality, that's what it is. And it's the first one that, by the way, has started here. And anybody remember who started it?
didn't George Washington do it on accident?
Yeah, Washington and his Native American allies. They cut up a guy named Jumonville, and his brother happened to be the one in charge of the whole French Legion there. So when he finds out that his brother got hacked to death by Native Americans, he wants revenge. He goes after Washington. Washington builds basically a fort out of sticks called Fort Necessity, but he builds it in a valley, and he gets pinned down. And it just shows he's not a very good commander at that point. Now, keep in mind, to be fair to him, he's 21 years old. Okay, but he just bungles his way all the way through this expedition and causes the French and Indian War. Okay, so weirdly enough, if it wasn't for the American Revolution, we'd remember George Washington as the worst commander in history. Okay, we'd be telling stories of don't be like Washington. Okay, so luckily for him, another chance at greatness comes up. Okay, but he starts the conflict. The French and the British are fighting at that point, mostly for the Western territories. Okay, where does Great Britain end and France begin at that point? And they fight this titanic struggle over the course of 9 years over here, 7 years over in Europe. And when they finally get done with it, the British have prevailed. The French have to vacate a number of different locations, okay, including, for that matter, Canada. The British basically control North America because of the French and Indian War. Now, when that occurs, the British look at the situation and in 1763 do something that starts the general progression towards independence. What was that act that happened in 1763?
It was something about not going past the Appalachian Mountains. I forget what it was actually called.
Called the Proclamation. Proclamation of 1763. They drew a line, and Miss Baker is correct. They drew a line across the Appalachian Mountains and said, this is as far as you go. The rest of it is called the Western Reserve. The Western Reserve is reserved for Native Americans. Now, keep in mind, the Appalachian Mountains go directly through Pennsylvania and go down to and through places like West Virginia. It goes through Tennessee. It goes through Kentucky. What they're basically saying is Native Americans that live in places that, like today, would be considered Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Lexington, Kentucky, all those places that already had a trickling of settlers and traders, they were told that they were basically trespassing on Native American land at that point. And you know how well Americans do when they're told they can't go somewhere. This should be somewhat apparent in our current climate, okay? So naturally, when we're told we can't go someplace, what's the natural inclination? We go anyway, okay? And the reason, there's farmland, there's fur to be caught, there's fish to be caught, there's lumber out there. They're looking for God knows whatever, okay? They're looking to settle and prosper. As we start going across that line, the Native American allies, and keep in mind the British Native American allies during the French and Indian War were the 5 nations of the Iroquois League. They're not okay with us coming across those mountain ranges. So the Proclamation Line is going to be the first real kind of break between American colonists and the British. Okay, the British government makes a policy that the colonists don't agree with. Okay, then in 1764 they start their general discussion about, all right, we've fought this war, now how are we going to pay for it, because the British are broke at this point. So they come up with the genius idea of, well, we fought it over in the American colonies, to protect them, they should pay for it. The first thing that they taxed was not the Stamp Act. The first thing they taxed was sugar. That was in 1764. When they tax sugar, most Americans get peeved, but they don't really raise that much of a stink. This is why when they then choose a year later in 1765 to pass the Stamp Act, where it was this blanket thing that anything printed had to have a stamp of approval and you had to pay for it, that's when the Americans said, we're done. No, you can't do that. Now keep in mind, what's the one thing that had to have a stamp on it that was going to just ruffle the feathers of the Americans? It was the fact that you printed newspapers, because now you are preventing the ability for us to disseminate the written word. This is a key distinction that I don't know if I made a big stink about this in class, but you kind of need to know this. We're the most literate society in the world in the late 1700s. More people in America can read than even back in England, okay? We really like our reading, okay? Which is hard to comprehend nowadays with the amount of people out there that probably don't read enough, okay? But the Americans really are a literate society. And even if you can't read, you have friends or family members that can, and they can read to you. So they don't like limitations on what can be read, okay? Keep in mind right now, what are all your Facebook, Twitter, and whatever else feeds showing you? How many people are upset that Facebook and Twitter are starting to take things off the platform? Okay, any sort of misinformation about COVID-19, they're removing as misinformation and falsehoods. How many people that you know are saying, oh, they're taking away our right to have an opinion? Now, not to get too political here, they're doing probably the right thing by taking down these very misleading, documentaries that really are not documentaries. If you're one of those proponents of Plandemic, please stop. Okay, that's a discredited doctor. But when Facebook said, hey, we're going to take this down, and when YouTube said we're going to take it down, there were a bunch of people that said, how dare you? Why? We're a literate society. We don't like you taking away something that we can watch, something that we can talk about, something we can discuss. That's what they viewed the Stamp Act as being, that you're limiting our ability to disseminate information, okay? This is what inspires us to have our really first Congress. If you remember, we had the Albany Plan of Union back during the French and Indian War as a way of responding to an outside threat. We actually have a Congress called the Stamp Act Congress, where we bring some colonies together to discuss how we're going to handle this. And what's the thing that is birthed out of that? The committees of correspondence. Why do we have committees of correspondence? If you're going to limit our ability to type and print newspapers, well, then we're going to send letters that can then be disseminated around the colonies. And we're saying, all right, well, here I live in Massachusetts. Now I'm going to tell you in New Jersey what's happening up here. And then you're going to write me back and tell me what's happening in your neck of the woods. If I can't get information through news, then I'm going to get it from the pens of people that I know that are in charge and that are in some capacity leaders of that colony. Okay. So again, that's kind of the next step. They fire off all kinds of missives to the British government complaining, and eventually they repeal the Stamp Act. It takes about a year, but that's mostly because of the cross-Atlantic, communication. When they finally rescind that, they then follow it up with a series of other acts called the Townshend Acts. This was the idea that, all right, well, we're not going to tax them on the written word anymore. We're going to tax them on things like tea. We're going to tax them on things like paint. We're just going to tax them on these other commodities. At that point, they had transitioned from, hey, you're not going to limit what we say, to the traditional thing of no taxation without representation. That's when we started to really kind of hone in on the fact that you've already tried to limit our speech. And obviously you're doing that because we don't have any representation in Congress or in Parliament. Okay. When that occurs, that's when the Parliament starts to say, well, you have virtual representation. That wasn't good enough. Okay. Now, back and forth on this we go, but for the most part, it kind of dies down. The British do end up standing down from this and not trying to push too much of these taxes on us. What they do, however, and this is a bungling to the highest magnitude, is they misinterpret this as, well, if you're going to rise up and cause problems and you're not going to come to your own defense, we're going to have to defend our ports. So they send soldiers to New York and Boston. By doing so and basically ordering them in people's homes, that's what causes not only committees of correspondence to form again, but it eventually leads in 1770 to the Boston Massacre, when they're just tired of these red-coated heathens living in their city. That then spawns a whole host of other protest movements. But keep in mind, at that point, we're still talking 1770. We're still 5 years removed from the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord. So if this is a massive revolution, it's moving at a glacial pace. So what you need to always remember is we are not really, and remember we kind of talked about this in class, we're not really Americans yet. We're still British. Everybody at that point is British. Nobody is thinking independence in 1770. Maybe Sam Adams, maybe Ben Franklin, but nobody's voicing it openly. They would have been looked at a little weird at that point. Fast forward to 1773. That's when the British start really kind of hammering down a little bit. They still have the Tea Act. The colonists rebel in the Boston Tea Party, which is one of the most misrepresented events in American history. Yes, they dressed up like Native Americans. They were still a bunch of white guys. Everybody knew who they were. It was one of those snitches get stitches type mentalities. You're not going to tell on your neighbor because you're going to be, rooted out by the mob, if you will. So the British really have no way of combating the Sons of Liberty because everybody knows who did it. Everybody knows who did it, but nobody's going to say a word. So sure enough, what do? They punish the whole city. So the Boston Port Act comes in after that, where they shut down the port. They disband any sort of, elected officials. They disband the courts, which is what causes John Adams to transition from being just somebody who's opposed to some of the British policies to being a revolutionary leader. Because remember, he's the guy that stuck up for the soldiers during the Boston Massacre. He's the one that said, if the courts rule, then the British policies are fine. The king's policies are fine. It's when they don't live up to that John Adams makes the transition. That's when he becomes an American. Okay. Franklin officially becomes an American when he publishes a bunch of letters by Thomas Hutchinson, who, if you remember, was the governor of the colony. He publishes them to kind of, and he doesn't really do it himself. He sends it to a bunch of revolutionary leaders back in Massachusetts saying, hey, look, this is what your governor's been saying over here in England. And they publish them, and it becomes very obvious that Franklin's kind of the root cause of that. And when he's accused of basically being a traitor, Franklin says, all right, if you're going to treat me like this, then I'm going to be American. That's when he stops powdering his wig and he starts dressing in weird clothes, calling it American, clothing or whatever. That's when he's off the British train. Okay. When they form the army, okay, after Lexington and Concord and after Bunker Hill, the Battle of Bunker Hill, that's when Washington steps into the fray, becomes the leader of the Continental Army, and becomes an American himself. He's no longer a Virginia gentleman. Now he's an American because he's trying to bring the army together. Okay. And I was just reading a fascinating book of how Washington kind of formed the Continental Army. One of the first things he does is when he rides into camp, he immediately dismounts his horse and walks amongst the men. These are mostly New England guys. And he walks amongst them and talks to them as if they're equals, which immediately ingratiates. But what really got him a lot of cachet from this is they had a fight going on between two revolutionary soldiers. They were fighting. Washington basically rides up, jumps off the horse, jumps in between them, holds them both up. This is how strong Washington is at 6'3". He holds both of them up and says, "Are you done?" And these were both very large men that he was holding up, and he was basically just curling them. And that caused both guys to realize, wow, if this guy can lift me up, he can probably kill me. So they stopped fighting, and everybody in the crowd went, wow. And they just backed up, and they were like, all right, no messing with Washington. He's the man, okay? That's kind of the leader he was. He didn't say much, but man, he did things, okay? And again, it's part of that kind of mysticism about Washington is that he just always seemed to know what to do. Now, that's the revolutionary rhetoric. In 1774, they formed the First Continental Congress, okay, to discuss what to do about the present issues going on with Boston, going on with some of these other acts. They disband and come back in after Lexington and Concord. When Lexington and Concord happened, they formed the Second Continental Congress, and they immediately dispatched the Olive Branch Petition, okay? When they realized the Olive Branch Petition isn't working, when King George III basically doesn't even open it, doesn't read it, sends it back, okay, basically tears it up, that's when they realized they're pretty much in it for the long haul. Bunker Hill happens, and that's when they really start to seriously talk about independence. And in 1776, in July, that's when they finally present a paper to the world explaining why they're becoming an independent nation. Okay. Obviously, the Declaration of Independence, that Thomas Jefferson predominantly writing it, but it's with the spirit of Franklin and Adams behind them, along with Sherman and Livingston too. But they produce this document that's going to explain to the world why they're breaking away. And remember, when we talked about this, it's not just to tell Britain the reasons why they're leaving. For the most part, the British can kind of deduce that for themselves. It's also explaining places like France, here's why we're leaving, we need help, okay? It's also explaining to their own people, remember, we're a literate society, here's why we're leaving, okay? If you agree with these policies, then you belong with us. Because remember the law of the third, at the time of the revolution, a third were loyalists, a third were revolutionaries, and a third weren't sure. They just wanted to farm, and they didn't care. Jefferson's trying to get that third of undecideds to become decided on their side, okay? Because if we're fighting each other, there's no way we can beat the British. Of course, long story short, over the course of a very long revolutionary conflict, all the way up to 1783, we finally do get our independence, okay, through the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Okay, this is after a long stretch of really tough generaling by Washington, where he has his bad times like Brandywine, and New York is really just a disaster. Okay, the Battle of Long Island into the Battle of New York is just awful. But he does have his high points, like the Battle of Trenton. That's him crossing the Delaware, which, by the way, if the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware is on your AP test, it's a crock of, you know what? It's just pure propaganda. That painting was painted by a German in 1848. Okay. And if you ever go to the Delaware, it's not a massive river up where he crossed it. In Trenton, it's a decent sized river, but it's not as wide as the Ohio River. And in most places, you could actually walk a horse across it. Okay, so that painting of Washington kind of, standing triumphantly at the top of the ship. First of all, it's Christmas night. It's freezing. It's snowing and sleeting. There's no way he's in, huddled with the rest of his guys going, who came up with this plan? It's nuts. But that was one of the high points. Trenton was a master stroke on Washington's part, followed up by the Battle of Princeton. Okay. And a side note, Battle of Princeton is what is the battle that actually presents this little known artillery commander by the name of Alexander Hamilton to Washington's attention. He sees him, manning the guns and commanding that. Hamilton's the one that fires the shot that decapitates King George III's painting in Princeton Hall. So Hamilton kind of catches the eye of Washington, and Washington then kind of elevates him, and that's the start of Hamilton. Coming soon to Disney Plus, in case you didn't notice today. They announced that Hamilton the musical will be on Disney Plus July 3rd. So for those of you that are Hamilton fans, there you go. Anyway, America finally does get their independence after Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris. After that, we go through a very, very shaky part where we try and form a government. And if you remember, and this is the part AP students always forget, we had a failed government. We tried in 1777 to write the Articles of Confederation and have a Confederation government. Okay, the Confederation government, by its very definition, is a bunch of independent states trying to work together. Think of the European Union today. Okay, a bunch of independent European countries that are trying at least to have an economic relationship. That's basically what the Articles of Confederation was trying to do. 13 separate states all trying to manage together. It didn't work. Aside from not being able to tax, not being able to raise an army, it was just not a very good document. 9 of 13 had to agree in order to make the law, and all 13 had to agree to make any changes whatsoever to the document. So it became very apparent that they needed a new document. And in 1787, they produced the Constitution. Who, of course, was front and center at that was Washington. Now, Washington did not participate very much. He ran the day-to-day operations. He was the president of the convention, but if in anything, he was really just a figurehead who allowed the machine to kind of work. And the machine was manned by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and to a very, very small degree, Ben Franklin. But those were the people that were really kind of pushing the plans and getting things into play. Okay. And if you remember when we talked about this, Madison would present something. The other side would come in and say, that's too far. Here's our other plan. And then Hamilton would jump on the other side to the extreme to make Madison's plan look like it was common sense and middle ground. Okay. That was kind of the play that they made. What's really ironic is that those two individuals would eventually be the founders of the two political parties, along with Jefferson with Madison. Okay, so what was weird is those two were really working in conjunction during the convention to create the Constitution, but immediately after that, both of them, Hamilton and Madison, are going to have very different views about what the Constitution actually means in practice. Okay. Of course, right after the convention, the main thing is who's going to be the executive, and they left it very vague because they basically said, all right, we'll let Washington figure it out. So Washington becomes our first elected president. He wins a unanimous presidency. He serves 2 terms, as you know. He sets the precedent. He has a rocky 8 years in office. It's not easy. He's setting up the government. Everything he's doing is a precedent. He's got problems with England. If you remember, Jay's Treaty was not exactly an easy one in 1794. He has the French Revolution to deal with. Okay, and that's happening in 1789 all the way up to and through the rest of his presidency. So he's dealing with it from the very beginning. What to do with the French? And remember, in 1793, he's going to declare neutrality, which is going to ruffle the feathers of the French. Because remember, we were supposed to be friends with them. They were friends with us during our revolution. They expected us to come to their aid, especially when they were attacked by Britain, and we did not. Okay. So that also spawned a number of different issues, including, we didn't talk a lot about this guy, but Citizen Genet, who was the French official that showed up and said, I am the new representative from the new government of France. And there are a bunch of Americans that said, oh, Citizen Genet, oh, here he is. Washington basically told him to go kick sand. So we were not exactly good friends at that point with the French, okay? And of course, immediately after that, when Washington steps away, John Adams steps in, who has none of the people skills of Washington and isn't exactly put into a good position because, as I said, when we talked about Adams, you never want to be the guy that follows greatness. You never want to be the guy that starts after Tom Brady leaves. Guess what? New England's going to go through that this year, and it's not going to be the same, okay? You really have to feel for a guy named Jared Stidham right now, because he is either going to be as great or greater, or he's not going to measure up no matter what he does. And the most likely scenario is he's not going to measure up. Same thing happened to John Adams. John Adams was great in his own right, had a great resume, but still doesn't mean that you're, on to be great yourself. Okay. All right. That takes us all the way through the first 3 units. Questions, comments, concerns?
Not really. That pretty much cleared up everything I was confused about. I was really it was mostly that it had been so long that I kind of forgot most of it. It wasn't really that I was unsure about what was going on. It was like, if you mentioned something, I'd be like, oh yeah, I know what that is. But if you wanted to ask me what happened between blank and blank, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, and again, we're just doing this to kind of give a basic overview. I can certainly go into greater detail, but I'd put you to sleep. And there's a good chance that many of you are. Hughes, you still with me?
Yeah.
All right. Hunter, you've never turned on your microphone.
Yeah, I know.
Attaboy, there he is. Osborne, you don't talk much, so I'm not going to call on you. I'm not going to call you out. Jones, you still with me?
Yeah.
Super. By the way, Jones, I want to point this out, and I'm going to post it later on. I had to go in yesterday to clean out my classroom, took down one of the maps in the back of my room, and a hand-drawn Spanish Inquisition fell out.
I'm
You
not
wouldn't have to
surprised.
know anything about that, would you?
I don't remember anything, so you're as surprised as I am.
It was. I was not expecting it, so well done. I do want to say it was very depressing to clean out my classroom with no one in the building. So sad. All right, anybody else any questions?
No.
Okay, so here's the deal. A couple of tips of how to take the exam or how to prep for the exam. All this week, you should be trying to get decent amount of sleep. Okay, try and get onto a sleep schedule. Okay, I know it's not easy. I know many of you are weirdly staying up till like 3 a.m. and then sleeping till 1. Okay, you need to get away from that. You need to get back onto somewhat of a sleep schedule. Now, I'm not saying you got to get on a sleep schedule where you wake up at 7 a.m. or anything and conquer the world. What I am saying is you have to wake up sometime on Friday morning where you don't feel like you're in a fog. Okay, so you've got to kind of get on a sleep schedule where you're at least waking up in the morning before noon and at least trying to function. Okay, you need to make sure that you've eaten something. You need to make sure that before you take the exam, you've gone to the bathroom. That is so important. I cannot stress that enough, because if you only have 45 minutes to type, you don't want to take the laptop into the facilities with you. Okay, aside from it being growth, you don't do your best work there. Okay. You're decidedly preoccupied. So please make sure you take care of that before you go into the exam. Okay. Make sure you have something close by, water bottle or whatever else, that will also help you. You need to stay hydrated before the exam and during the exam. Okay. If you're thirsty, you know you're not going to be able to concentrate. So please make sure you take care of that. Okay. However, you will notice I've got my classy Hello Kitty cup here. Obviously,
Fantastic choice.
far too many women in my house. The only one that's clean. Who's in charge of dishes? So you probably shouldn't have it next to your computer, because Lord knows I tip it over, we got problems. Okay, but have it somewhere close to where you can just quickly sip and then, put it over off to the side and continue working, because if you're preoccupied by that, especially at home, you're going to waste time. Okay, so just be kind of prepared for that. I always have a notepad next to the computer if I need to write things down. While you are typing your essay, you may want to have a notepad to where you can write down notes as you're going through your 5 documents. Okay, you may want to write down notes about, I've seen, let's say the question is about the American Revolution. You can be writing down your outside information along the way. You can flip it and do a basic outline of what you want to write. Okay, which is, in all honesty, the smartest thing to do. Okay, so have something to write, a dependable pen and or pencil, and a dependable notepad where you've got enough to write things down. Okay, that's something that I think is a nice little kind of safety net for you when you're just trying to focus 10. I stress this, and I can't stress this enough. You cannot depend on that time period to be enough for you to go back through your notes. You cannot depend on that time period to go through your book. You can't depend on that. I know it's tempting to hear, open note, open book. I don't need to look over anything. You can have your 5 steps to a 5 there, but you know full well you're not going to have time in 45 minutes to even read one of the passages that gives a summation of a chapter or even a unit. You're not going to have that kind of time. What they are there for is to make sure you don't make a stupid mistake. So you're not typing, the presidency of Andrew Jackson, but it's really James K. Polk. The idea here is, if they say, what is the implication of the election of 1828? Why do you have your textbook? So you remember who the hell won 1828. It's Andrew Jackson, by the way. He beat John Quincy Adams. Okay. If it's 1824, that's the one where Jackson still won but lost. Okay. John Quincy Adams became president. It's only there so you have some sort of resource with which to say, man, I don't remember something about that. Flip, 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 flip. There it is. Okay, frame of mind good, and now I can go. It is not there for you to be like, John Quincy Adams. Who is that again? Okay, John Quincy Adams. Okay. I mean, obviously, if you're completely clueless as to how to answer, you're going to need to read through it, but you're going to have to run through your typing to get through probably the 5 paragraphs that you're going to need to at least have a functional answer. The last thing I will say, while I've been going through your 6 DBQs, and I'm going through the 6th one tomorrow, the glaring weakness is the thesis. Many of you are doing great on documents. Many of you are doing great on outside information, but then you're not making an argument. You're either restating the question, you're turning in a jumbled mess that sounds like it knows what it's talking about but never says anything, or you're turning in a restatement of the question. Okay, and I kind of got lost in my own, either vague restatement of the question or just a jumbled mess. Remember, your thesis is you're making a clear argument. You're stating that this is what they intend to prove. Okay, so whatever the question, the prompt is, you need to make sure you're answering the whole thing, you're addressing the whole thing, and that your essay has a direction on it. Okay, Now, I know it's tempting to restate the question, and I'm not sure which 7th grade English teacher told you to restate the question as your thesis, but they were wrong. Okay? A thesis is your argument. All of these prompts can be answered a multitude of different ways. Restating the question doesn't frame the argument at all. You're taking a component of it and changing it. Okay? So for that, I'm going to just quickly bring up previous DBQs. I'm going to pick one at random. Okay? DBQ. Effects of the Revolution from 2005. To what extent did the American Revolution fundamentally change American society? In your answer, be sure to address the political, social, and economic effects of the revolution in the period of 1775 to 1800. Okay, we actually went over this sometime during the year. Okay, if I'm writing a thesis and all of my documents here, there's a woodcut of an American woman. There's a Pennsylvania packet in 1779, a message to Congress from the Chickasaw chiefs, statutes at large of Virginia, United Indian Nations speech to the Confederate Council. There's a stupid medal of the Philadelphia Society of whoever, an ordinance of the government, a Madison Federalist paper, Molly Wallace valedictory address, Young Ladies Academy of Philadelphia. Who the hell cares? Okay, all these documents are supposed to help me to assess the extent the American Revolution fundamentally changed American society in political, social, and economic effects. How many different ways could I go with that? Okay. Now, of course, the temptation would be the American Revolution changed American society specifically in political, social, and economic ways. That's just a restatement of the question. Okay. The American Revolution was so important to American history and changed the way democracies work. That may be true, but you're not saying anything directly. You're not arguing. And that's that jumbled mess of words or simplistic response that I'm talking about. What do you have to do? If I'm answering this question, I could take it a multitude of ways, but I might take it from the standpoint that if we're talking about the change to American society and they're talking about political, social, and economic effects, the United States in its early republic transitioned from a mercantile to a capitalist system while also altering their government from a fundamentally monarchist to a republic regime. I know many of you are saying, I would never, what? This is the style of thesis you have to come up with, okay? It doesn't have to be that high level because I just gave you basically a book, okay? That would be something they would write in the master's degree program, okay? What I'm saying here is it has to be an argument. Notice that in that I would have to show, and these documents that I read through would have to point me in that direction. I would have to show that the economy changed from mercantilism to now capitalism, where the Americans are making their own choices about what they're buying and how they're selling it. Okay. I would have to prove that. And then I would also have to prove that we've moved from parliamentary monarchists, meaning we've got a king and a parliament. Now we've got a duly elected president and we've got a duly elected Congress. Okay. That the people have the power. Now that's one way of answering that. I could also say that while the American Revolution changed the focus of the American government, it did not change the society in specific ways. Okay. That's still a thesis. Okay. You're saying, yes, America did change, but it changed in name only. It did not change the society. And again, if the documents back you up, that can be a route you go as well. Okay. But notice what I'm saying here is I am taking the documents, I am taking the prompt, and I am creating a new argument based upon what I know, what the documents give me, and what kind of connection I can make. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yep.
Yeah.
Now's the time to ask, folks. I'm not going to judge you if you don't, if you're not sure. Okay, what I would do is spend the next few days obviously looking over kind of the basics, but I would also look up old DBQs and practice writing a thesis. How would you answer it? Okay, you don't have to look through all the documents. Notice I kind of just spun through the documents. Read the prompt. How would you frame an argument that doesn't just restate the question? Practice that skill. Okay. The AP board website is also offering review sessions. They're also offering review materials. If you have not logged into your student account on the AP board website, on the College Board website for AP US, that's where you should go to. Not to mention you've got your 5-Step 4-5 book. Okay, now we're coming up on 10:30. It's been a long evening. I appreciate you hanging in. We'll do this again tomorrow night. And as I said, tomorrow night we'll be covering units 4 through 6. Okay, so we'll be going through basically the 1800s. I'll be flying through material again, trying to make sure you have a basic understanding of where we're headed. Okay, but again, I'm encouraging you to bring questions. And as I told many of you that were showing up to DBQ sessions, this is the area tomorrow that I think your DBQ is going to come from. I really think you're going to get either an antebellum or a reconstruction question. I'm not 100%, but I really believe that's where you're going to get your question from. Okay. So if you can't attend tomorrow night, again, I will film it and post it so that you can go over it. Okay. I appreciate you guys coming in. Okay. I've got responses from everybody except for one person. If anybody talks to Miss Hines, can we find out if she's taking the exam or not? Hughes, do you have any contact with this child?
Yeah, I can text her.
Can you encourage her to reach out because she hasn't turned in any assignments yet either?
Yeah, I will.
Okay. It's not a knock against her. I'm just worried at this point.
I know she's alive though. I talked to her the other day.
Good. A pulse. That's important. I just found out that Ethan Heng is fine and alive and well too. So that's good. We're on a good track. Okay. So again, many of you have turned in what you need to turn in. You're all set when it comes to that part of it. If you need to make up any of them, a couple of you on here are a couple of short, do them tonight, do them tomorrow, get them in. It's really just a matter of you doing the practice. Okay. If you struggled on the thesis writing, and many of you did, for some of these DBQs that I gave you, rewrite the thesis and turn it back in if you want to figure out, hey, did I do this better this time? So if you want to practice, more than happy if you email me and say, hey, here's my redone thesis for DBQ number 2. How does this look? Okay, that's fine. You can do that as well. And for some of you that didn't do it at all, now's your chance. Hop on, get a couple more done so that we're at least passing fourth quarter. Okay, it's really not that hard to pass fourth quarter. I promise you. It just takes a little bit of work. Okay, because there are a few people that literally did it over this weekend, all 6 of them. So it's doable. I've seen it done. Okay. Again, if you have any questions, you can stay back. I am going to stop recording at this point so that you feel more comfortable. So if you have